Hi guys. If everyone's had enough of a break, I think we'll carry on with the last half. Yes? Cool. Thanks to Scott for that expeditious whirlwind tour of precedents. I suspect that our section of this evening's proceedings probably won't be that laboured either. Tonight we are having a little look at the Whalian-Gazzellian chapter on what they rather cryptically refer to as non-contractual obligations. We would say, torts and duty of care. It's kind of an interesting chapter. I don't know whether many of your projects are dealing with this. I was kind of hoping that Shane would touch base with us tonight, because I know that his project cuts across duty of care. But it's an interesting little area of risk management that we need to attend to. Interestingly, you'll note at the beginning of the chapter, Whaley and Gazzellian talk about, what they see as the four major players that you should be keeping an eye out for in terms of non-contractual obligations. And they talk about the environment, the market, stakeholders and customers. And they say, well, really, given that there's legislation dealing amply with each of those various different areas of potential risk, isn't this more of a situation of legislative and regulatory risk rather than non-contractual obligations risk? And they say there's a couple of reasons why you need to think of this more broadly than just legislative and regulatory risk. And that is that if you just focus in too tightly on the black letter requirements of the legislation governing the particular area of risk, you risk missing potential risks that might come from your broader set of obligations rather than just what the legislation dictates you ought to be doing. And the other thing is, they say that generally speaking, apart from the legislation, there is this broad notion of non-contractual obligations or duty of care that you need to keep in the back of your mind, that might not be in any way associated with any particular regulatory regime. So in usual Whalian Gazzellian fashion, they then go about looking for what they consider to be, a template for working out whether or not you might have non-contractual obligations or a duty of care owed to a particular party. And they use this California Supreme Court decision to form their template of questions to ask. And I tend to think that this is another instance of the authors, all along we've been saying, they tend to search for that hard data because of their various backgrounds that they bring to the text. They tend to search for this, hard data or the quantitative number that you can put on things, and they express a fair amount of frustration with what they call the woolliness of the whole notion of foreseeable risk and how rather inconvenient it is that there's no bright line test. I mean, you and I as lawyers know that there's many areas of law and of risk that can't be quantified and tied up with a nice neat bow And you have to have these woolly concepts in order to cover those situations where new risks emerge. You know, new duties will extend from one party to another in situations that haven't cropped up before. And this is just not one of those areas that you can, it's not like contractual risk, for example, which is much more amenable to the kinds of bright line tests that they kind of search for. Duty of care is one of those, you know, it's like a piece of string. How long is it? And so you see them kind of flailing about in the text, looking for answers which they never really seem to actually find. And in fact, if you note at the end of the chapter, there's this rather quaint, oh, hello, Shane. There's this rather quaint appendix of a whole heap of case citations that you can run away and have a look at if you wish to flesh out their proposed template that they have fashioned from this California Supreme Court decision. It all, to me, it's, like I said, smacks of a bit of discomfort with, you know, the woolliness of this area. And whilst you and I might be reasonably comfortable with that, I think the authors fairly demonstrably are not comfortable with that. So this is one of those chapters where I've kind of sent you off with some other resources to look at, to flesh out your own understanding of the area. And I just wanted to touch base with you to see how you were going with your readings in this area. And particularly, I don't know how far or how long ago you did torts, but whether you guys covered the case of Wallace and Cam. Joanna's looking perplexed. Robert's shaking his head. Okay, so it's probably... sorry, there's something in the chat I need to have a word. Oh, Shane says it rings a bell. It's a useful little case, and I think that there is a reasonable amount of divergence between the messiness of US law in this area and what, you know, I think of as, you know, a fairly helpful case from the High Court for us. And in that particular case, it was a failure to warn case. And I think it demonstrates quite nicely where Whaley and Ghazalian talk about this whole mixed up notion of proximate cause, where, you know, sometimes the US courts are talking about causation proper, and sometimes they're talking about scope of liability, and sometimes they're talking about both together. Wallace and Cam kind of nicely says, for our purposes, the two are reasonably separate, and indeed we have legislation now that sets up the whole area of causation quite nicely for us, and we have that factor that we need to consider. Well, is there factual causation here? And then if there is, the court needs also to consider, well, okay, be that as it may, is liability within its proper scope here if we give the applicant compensation for the losses that they're asking for? And in that case, it was a failure to warn by a surgeon, and there were two separate risks that were at issue in that particular case. The first risk was something called neuropraxia, which is like a temporary damage that is done to the nerves in a particular area where the procedure was carried out. And the risk of neuropraxia, whilst it was temporary, involved fairly significant pain to the patient. And the second risk was permanent and what were called catastrophic paralysis in the area in which the procedure was carried out. Now, the surgeon in that particular case failed to warn of both of those risks, and the patient underwent the procedure and sustained the first risk. So the first risk crystallised and the patient ended up with some neuropraxia. So whilst temporary, it was extraordinarily painful, and obviously so painful that they sued. On its way up to the High Court, there was various different decisions, but in the High Court it was quite interesting. They said when you're talking about that first limb of the legislation, when you're talking about factual causation, really it's a fairly simple matter. You're just talking about the but-for test. I mean, everybody knows what the but-for test is. It holds no real magic. It's not rocket science. And they said in that case, well, there was no risks disclosed, a complete failure to warn. And if those risks had been disclosed, the patient wouldn't have undergone the procedure. So they said, on the first limb, you've struck out. Factual causation was actually found, but that wasn't the end of the matter. And this is where I think we get that nice kind of clarity happening. Okay, yes, there's factual causation here. There was a failure to warn, and the patient underwent the procedure, and one of those risks crystallised, and the patient sustained loss. But they said, hang on a minute here, we really need to work out, does that particular applicant deserve compensation for the actual risk that crystallised? And they said, if in fact the patient had been warned of both risks, the patient would not have undergone the procedure, but both risks had not crystallised. Okay, just one of those risks had crystallised. So if the patient had only been warned of that risk that crystallised, would they have undergone that same procedure? And they said, sorry, we can't actually take into account the applicant's evidence because it was self-serving. And they said it's really only reliable where the applicant's evidence goes against their own interests. So we'll set that aside. Let's have a look at the question. If the patient was advised that there was some risk of temporary damage causing pain, would they have still undergone that procedure? And they found, yes, he would have undergone that procedure. So there was, in terms of scope of liability, it meant that while factual causation had been found, no compensation was going to be given because the scope of liability wouldn't allow it. Yes, the proper scope of what that surgeon should have actually been responsible for didn't extend to the circumstances of having failed to advise of both risks. If he had just warned of the one risk and that risk crystallised, would the event have still occurred? Yes, it would have. Yes? So I think that provides a nice little divergent from US law, where they tend to muck about and sometimes conflate those two issues. We're kind of fortunate in having, that legislative guidance, which has now got a reasonable amount of decent interpretation from the High Court. So I think there, at least in failure to warn cases and in cases where you have what the court considered a non-coextensive scope of liability, yes, you might be factually causing somebody else's loss. But if you shouldn't properly be responsible for that, they're not going to be found responsible. I think, it's a nice little side discussion to what you've read in the text. It's not quite so muddy over here as what it might be over in the US. And also in the US, you've got that complicating, each state has different laws with these things, and often they're contradictory. And I think this is one of those areas where US law can really get tied up in itself, and hence the kind of frustration that permeates the discussion throughout this particular chapter. Did anybody have any queries about their discussion of duty of care and the relevant legal principles that apply around finding a duty of care? Shane, you may have some comments on this, given that your project involves some issues of duty of care. Hello.
No, I'm fairly good there. I mean, I think the duty of care in the task that I'm doing, you have to show that the duty of care exists. And I think because it's such a broad at the moment, such a broad outline of advice, and not specific to the actual client, I don't think the duty of care necessarily exists, because I don't think there's the I think it does if it's patently wrong information that things are sent out, but without actually having the I don't know the word, the actual structured advice, I don't think it's as
right.
I think.
Yes. Sure. Okay. I guess the other question that I wanted to throw out for you this evening was your discussion, well, the discussion in some of the resources about ASIC's duty of care to third parties, and particularly that rather interesting class action against ASIC for allegedly breaching their duty of care to those rather unlucky investors in Storm Financial. Did you manage to have a look at any of those resources? No.
Yes, sorry, I didn't read that one. I read through, I think a lot of the ones I commented on. I do know just with regards to Storm Financial,
Oops.
various places, and everyone seems to have an opinion on what really went wrong at Storm Financial, and everyone, people think that it's all the Commonwealth Bank's fault because everything was going swimmingly until they refused to give an overdraft on the or something similar. But I haven't read the article about on here. Only the ones I think I've commented on. More to BP spill.
Ah, yes. Yes. Did you other guys manage to read the BP stuff, Robert?
Yes. It's the big thing I think that I take out of it is that had that happened to someone other than BP, they probably would not have been able to pay anything like the damages that they did. And I think that's a significant problem generally because, in the Bowen Basin, we've had recently several mines change hands for $1. Plus, the companies have paid maybe 120 million or something to the people who purchased it for $1, saying, we think that you'll need that to recover it after it's finished. And the problem I see is that is that money going to be still there at the end of that time, or are the taxpayers going to be left to do the recovery work of all the mines? Rio Tinto's got out, Anglo Coal's got out. They're major companies. They've sold these things for $1 and also paid someone else to accept responsibility for it. But are they doing that and taking an assumption that they're going to get out of it cheaply because they won't have to pay the full cost of recovery?
Mm.
And, with BP, there would have been hardly any corporations that could have sustained those costs that came from that. And to me, that is a significant problem for risk management and for both governments and for corporates.
Mm.
And I think what may happen is that it may affect, because of the changing political paradigm that we're going through at present time with the increased regulation and everything else, and governments looking to force the corporate sector to pay for different things. There could become a situation where the corporate sector will become much more risk averse because of the cost of any of these duty of care things, other matters other than things like reputation. Because I think the changing political paradigm is going to put more focus on environmental and sort of customer and duty of care type matters that could become hugely expensive for the corporates.
And in fact, whaling New about judgments that have been bankrupting to various corporates that have faced them. Yes, I think it's a serious issue. Although, do you think it's necessarily a bad thing that corporates become more risk averse? Perhaps another way of flipping that on its head is, would it be a bad thing if corporates thought twice before engaging in the more extreme risky behaviour? I'm not sure necessarily that that's a bad thing.
Well, quite frankly, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Because I think in recent times, the GFC was typical, and that the preparedness for the corporate sector, if they could make, significant income out of a thing that was very risky, they were prepared to take the risk. And that, but I think if things go the way I sort of envisage them going, it's going to, it could very well bankrupt a lot of corporates. So I think it will be good to, for corporates to reassess their exposure to risk.
I agree completely. And I think this is where, Whaley and talk about this being a broader issue than just focusing on your black letter responsibilities to, regulatory responsibilities. the environment, although sadly Ron's not with us because he seemed to disagree that there was any danger to the environment or climate change. I was hoping to have a rather interesting discussion with him on that. But the text was saying it really is a broader issue than just looking at what regulatory responsibilities you have. It is this broader notion of being a good corporate citizen. You know, it's being prepared to get in there, and if you've done something wrong, to make sure that you repatriate whatever it is, that whatever losses have occurred. I understand your issue with the transfer of those mines for $1 and being concerned about whether or not the money's going to be there in the bank, you know, when the parties really need it. I mean, you've only got to look at the James Hardie fiasco, you know, where you had the what was it called again? Mesothelioma, the lung cancer that was caused from the asbestos. I mean, they said that they were going to put hundreds of millions of dollars away into accounts. And when it came to paying for victims, you know, there was a lot of finger pointing, but not a whole lot of payment going on. And then, you know, James Hardie was able to restructure and centre operations, I think it was over in Ireland. I mean, this is a rather extraordinary level of evading one's responsibilities as a good corporate citizen. And, you know, I would hazard a guess that, you know, huge damages like we saw in the BP instance, I think that they're a good thing, because they're kind of akin to a regulatory nudge, aren't they? Except from the judicial side of things. You know, if you're not going to be a good corporate citizen, well, we're going to make you pay anyway. And I think there's a decent whack of deterrent function that goes along with that as well. So, yeah, I think that's
I think the environment's definitely changed because corporates for the last, or probably till about 2010, were significant contributors to jobs. And so governments were inclined to support them and to, you know, sort of do things that they wanted. The situation with offshoring, with automisation, those things, the corporates are now moving in the opposite direction for economic reasons.
Yeah.
And I think the governments will say, well, you're going to pay one way or another. And, you know, as I said to Scott earlier, with the tax office winning a $300 million ruling from Chevron there for a small intra corporation loan, there's another one that's over $1 billion that they think they'll get that as well. So, you know, that's a significant impost that they're going to do. And I think that the paradigm's changing, and I think the corporate sector will definitely have to start reassessing their appetite for risk and the sort of things, because I think the other thing is social license is going to become much more valuable.
Yes.
But you know,
yeah,
I think it's definitely.
Yeah, I found it interesting. Shane's comment in the perusal documents about you know, how in the BP scenario it was kind of surprising that there was so little action taken by the regulators to not just pursue the corporates, but to pursue individuals. The only individuals, from what I can gather, that were pursued in that instance were two relatively mid-level line supervisors, and one executive that they charged with obstructing the investigation, and another employee that had also apparently engaged in obstruction. The two employees that were charged with negligence, they got off, I believe, and the executive was acquitted, and the last employee, I believe, is just facing the charges now of obstruction. But there was, I think, a surprisingly low amount of regulator conduct against individuals. I think that's an area that's going to just expand. It's not just an issue of corporate responsibility. It's particularly not just in terms of, you know, who the regulators pursue, but your point about social license. I think there was a fairly large groundswell of public opinion that, you know, surely in all of this fiasco with BP, there was more individuals, particularly executives, that should have been held responsible for the many decisions that led up to that accident. And I noticed that Shane posted that nice little article on, you know, the 7 physical or 8 physical failures that led immediately to the accident. But what I find intriguing is the many irresponsible, high-level decisions that were taken prior to that, even to that whole set of scenarios crystallising in the accident. And I think we'll find more regulator action against individuals as this notion of, you know, the importance of social license, the importance of reputation makes its play, you know, both with regulators and with the courts. An interesting little case study there. That's probably all we really need to say. The only other thing that I wanted to talk about was your take on the whole adoption of behavioural economics and regulatory nudges in the area of, you know, adopting responsibility for non-contractual obligations. What do you think? I know that Ron has some fairly strong ideas about the paternalistic nature of the whole behavioural economics exercise. What's your take? We haven't heard from you tonight, Joanna. What do you think about the whole introduction of behavioural economics into this?
Well, I'm a big fan of behavioural economics. I think it's the only way you're going to be able to create anything that really works with real people, because just as like the share market shows us that we really are really bad at making kind of logical decisions. We make, you know, everyone uses intuition, or really, you know, there's just so much bias, and the ASIC stuff really focused a lot on talking about the different biases, which just seems like a really just something in general at the moment that's getting focused on a lot, which I think it's really the only way forward to make a workable system that people can use.
Yeah, I agree. What about you, Shane? You want to add your 2 cents?
Yeah, I found the behavioural thing actually quite interesting, because I went off on a bit of a tangent there, because I think it talked about the finances and how people react to certain things. And I went on a bit of a tangent to see how many people are looking at self-managed funds there, purely from a behavioural thing about whether they, if they've got their idea, if they can do things better and if they're following up on it. It's actually surprising how many people are investing in self-managed super funds now. They seem to be not performing as well as a managed fund, but there seems to be a very interesting number. It's quite high. It's higher than I thought it would be. I kind of expected there would be a rise in it. They said something like 31% increase in the last so many years. It's really coming along. But they said, the value of it, you have to have more than about 200,000 in super before it seems to be worth it, which most of the people don't have, but they're still kind of increasing with it. But then I went on, like I said, that was the beginning of a tangent, and I went self-managed super funds. I better get back to actually what I'm looking at. But then
that's rather interesting of itself, though, isn't it? Because if people are continuing to, increasingly investing in these things, and despite the fact that they don't necessarily have that critical mass of funding behind them, they don't necessarily have the financial wherewithal and the nous to invest. And as Joanna just said, in terms of share-based investment, things can go rather spectacularly wrong. And it's another one of those cases of kind of behavioural economics being able to step in and go, really, what, these people are not choosing rationally. Maybe this is cause for some intervention here.
Yeah, and I think it's said in there as well. They're talking about people who are a lot more confident in their ability, probably overly confident in their ability to mitigate financial risks. And I think I put in something there about
mortgages.
Buying a house the first time we looked, and I was still only an apprentice electrician at the time. My wife was just out of university, and the amount of money they've said that this was pre-GFC because I'm a bit older than some others, but this is pre-GFC. They told us the amount of money we could have. I mean, there was never any chance we'd ever pay that money back ever. But I mean, it was there. The offer was there, and we had pre-approval for. They gave the range there, and like I said, it was actually, we like to think we have a level head on our shoulders. But I can easily see someone saying, "Oh wow, that's more than what we're looking for. But if we can have it, let's take it, and buy a bigger house, buy whatever they like to do, and then kind of try and mitigate that afterwards. And then obviously, then you have the GFC."
Yes.
A lot of trouble.
Good luck with that. Yes, I agree. And interestingly, in the course of that speech, they talk about their research into the kinds of forms that directors have to fill in. And they were using behavioural economics to kind of redraft the forms because they found that, even the way that directors were asked to disclose and the way the information was presented had a real bearing on the outcome of whether or not things were done successfully. I think this is, in terms of banks, the information is presented in such a biased fashion, biased to the bank, and I think they really skirt with that fine line between, the disclosure they are absolutely required to make to the customer and, the gilding of the lily in their own best interests. And it's an interesting case, isn't it? And
and it put in there as well that I think it said something along the lines of the more they disclosed, or the way they were disclosing, I think that's what you're saying, is they actually disclose it, and the clients were actually more inclined to go with it after reading the disclosure statements, which is, you see all these things there, it should be giant red flashing lights saying, hang on, think about this. And they go, oh, wow, they disclosed it. So, well, at least we know. And it seemed to be, off we go. I couldn't believe it when they were saying, what the studies were showing, because you'd kind of think it'd go the complete opposite way. So I guess
Yes.
they put a regulation in there, and people are clever enough to.
That's right. I liked your comment about the disclosure of conflicts and how people seem to be more trusting after a disclosure had been made. And I think I responded by saying, well, perhaps that's that kind of misguided sense of, oh, well, if my advisor has disclosed that they have a conflict, wow, that must have taken some guts to kind of disclose their awkward position they find themselves in, but they're still prepared to help me. Wow, I'm going to trust them even more. It's crazy. I mean, I actually wonder how the traditional economic approach of the rational man has survived for as long as it has, because I think behavioural economics really shows, that's just not how things work in the real world.
The marketing sector's been doing that for many, many years, using the behavioural sciences and that.
Yes, and to great effect. Does anyone have any queries on the whole behavioural economics side of things? I know we all have our own viewpoints as to whether it's effective or not. I'm kind of disappointed that Ron's not here, because we would have had a rather good devil's advocate for a lot of what we've been saying. The only other thing that that I wanted to raise for your attention, and that was the whole issue of whether or not our notions of non-contractual obligations involved that sense of moral blameworthiness, and the text goes into the whole issue of moral blameworthiness and reviews it in the sense of that California Supreme Court decision. And I did put up a resource which I'll let you look at or not, depending on your time constraints. But that was the Guggenkamp article on moral blameworthiness. It's kind of a finer point. Moral blameworthiness is usually assumed to be tied in with this whole area. And although that Guggenkamp article does throw in some nice arguments to the contrary, so if you've got the time to have a look at that, have a look at that. Other than that, I have arrived at probably what's the end of my discussion as well. Rather inconveniently, Scott, I stopped the recording halfway and then started a new recording, so we're going to have to load up 2 recordings. Apologies for that, but yeah, I pressed the wrong button.
I've done that before. It's not a problem.
It's all recorded, it's just in 2 slices, that's all.
Yeah. Yeah, I also had one where there's a blackout or something in the middle, so there's like in 3 pieces.
I noticed a couple of times you had to reignite the candles in your dungeon.
Get a good workout waving at the motion sensors in the room.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys.
Yep.
We can have an early night tonight if you like.
Yeah. Okay. See you all next week.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Good night.
I'll stop the recording.